Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. And as chairman of the Danish Foreign Policy Association, I would like to extend a warm welcome to Rector Federica Mogherini. We are very happy to have you here today in Denmark, that you would come here. I'm sure you only came because the weather is actually better in Denmark than it is in Rome. And we only know it's bad in Rome because we had a tennis match yesterday. Your present position as rector of the College of Europe and as the head of the newly established, which you have done, the Diplomatic Academy, it's very important job you have in educating young persons for European affairs. Many Danish alumni have attended the college, who later became members and leaders of the Danish society. Among those, a Danish prime minister, several senior diplomats, including the coming Danish permanent representative and the former Danish permanent representative, a former Danish ambassador in Paris and NATO, and many scholars of high esteem. Even though Rector Mogherini present has a very important job, she has held several equally important executive jobs earlier. Among those, as member of the Italian Parliament, as foreign minister and high representative of the European Union of Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and in that capacity, vice president of the European Commission. In that capacity, she was instrumental, among other things, in brokering the nuclear deal with Iran, the so-called Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015. She also initiated an important revision of an old security strategy from 2003. The new strategy was called the European Union Global Strategy and was adopted by the EU in 2016. She also tried hard to implement the so-called Ukraine-Minsk agreement from September 2014. And of course, as we all know, not because of Rector Mogherini, but because of circumstances, it was not very successful. I will not mention more of your achievements, as I know the audience is more interested in hearing you, what you have to say. There's certainly enough to talk about. The floor is yours.
Ambassador, dear friends, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me today here. And it's great to see so many friends, former colleagues and students, alumni among the audience, colleagues in different capacities, both when I was a member of parliament or minister or high representative or rector today. It really makes me feel home, also because indeed you have arranged the wonderful weather that reminds me of my original home, even if indeed climate change makes it so surreal that the weather is upside down these days. Thank you very much also because I think that today is also an opportunity for us to somehow celebrate the 50th anniversary of Denmark being part of the, at the time, European community, and today successfully turned into the European Union. And I would say that there is probably nothing more evident of how good that choice was at the time, and how good it is today to have Denmark as a member of the European Union without opt-outs, and also covering CSDP, Common Security and Defense Policy. But I'll come to that in a moment. You gave me a title for the lecture that could take us to next winter, so that we see the difference in the changing climate over the seasons. But I'll try to say a few words on the topic and then leave enough time for an exchange, and I'm very much interested in that. First of all, yes, we are in a critical juncture. We are in a critical juncture for the European Union, for Europe more in general, but also for the world as it is today. And I think that we have a special responsibility, somehow a duty, to stop 1 second and reflect on where are we in this critical juncture and what is the time that we are living. Because you referred to the many good things, some critical things, also some difficult things that we managed to achieve during my mandate. It was a collective effort, collective work, but that was a time of challenges, 2014, 2019, when I was High Representative and Vice President, but these were relatively easy times compared to those that we're living today. It was times when I actually started my mandate, yes, with the beginning of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, because now it's a fully fledged war of aggression, but at that time it started with the annexation of Crimea and the illegal activities of Russia and Russian forces in Donbas. So it started there, but it was also the times of the climate agreement in Paris. It was also the times of the Sustainable Development Goals in the United Nations. It was also the times, you reminded it, of the nuclear deal with Iran, that were all results of a multilateral work. Somehow I had the privilege of starting my mandate in the European institutions with a couple of years of multilateralism that was delivering and functioning. And the European Union was somehow a leading force in that. Then things started to change and deteriorated. I perfectly remember the time when we worked on the global strategy, 2016. It was definitely not the best of times for the European Union, with the referendum in the UK deciding for Brexit. You might remember, I ask you to bring back the memory and remember in the summer of 2016, everybody was talking about the beginning of the end of the European Union. And some of us really thought that this could have been the case. And here we are today, actually. This is good in the critical juncture we're living, where the European Union is not really questioned anymore in no member state, if not for some political discourse, but to my knowledge, there is no government that is actively working on exiting the Union. On the contrary, we see 10 potential new member states queuing up for accession and a revised, I would say, enthusiasm, or at least opening for having serious accession negotiations with new member states in the future. But this to say that those times were, yes, challenging and difficult, but still relatively okay-ish. It's not really a diplomatic term, but you would forgive me for that. Today, we see after two events that have really changed, in my opinion, our world and our Europe, we see today a situation that is completely disrupted. We had a pandemic that has shown us that long supply chains are not sustainable anymore in any field, including medicine equipment, medical equipment, and scientific research and producers. In a world where the European Union has always, and Europeans have always invested a lot in a globalized economy, interdependence, the pandemic has shown us that we have to be self-sufficient in some sectors that are critically strategic for us and for our survival. And then we've had a war, not only a war on European soil, but also we've had what an international law professor in the College of Europe has defined to me as a war of aggression that ticks all the boxes of breach of international law, initiated by a permanent member of the Security Council that is also a nuclear weapon holder. So a perfect combination that can not only destroy security in Ukraine and in Europe, but also can dismantle the credibility and the capacity of the United Nations system to act as a multilateral functioning organization, starting from the Security Council. That is what worries me the most, and that is what I believe makes this war different than any other. And this is probably a message we've not been passing too much to the so-called global south, to the rest of the world, that has sometimes the impression that we have double standards, which sometimes we have, I have to admit. But I think that in this case, the real point is this, that you have a permanent member of the Security Council with a nuclear weapon that is breaching all international law principles with a war of aggression, territorial aggression against its neighbor, which is unprecedented in our history. The war and coming after the times of pandemic, I think have shown us that, first of all, we live in a world where the multilateral system is not functioning anymore, which is something that we Europeans have difficulties in saying because we are strong defenders of that system. So we hate saying that this is challenged, if not broken. But I think that in certain cases, we need to face reality in order to fix it and move on. But also, I think that these two realities, the pandemic first and the war afterwards, have shown us that small might be beautiful, but in the world of today, we need big. We need the economy of scale, because the pandemic showed us that without the economy of scale, without coming together in big numbers and with the European solidarity and cooperation, we wouldn't have literally survived, literally. And the war has shown us that there are things that we can do together that we cannot do alone, like sanctions, for instance, and delivery of arms and other things. So I think that in the last 3 years, the case for the European Union has become much more evident than any time in the past. And I think that this, among many bad things, is probably a good takeaway. The European Union is very often seen, described as slow, divided, and irrelevant. Am I wrong? And this regardless of member states or audiences. This is normally the three words that people in general attribute to the European Union, and sometimes even people that have worked in the European Union. But I think that if we look at these 3 years, last 3 years, think of March 2020, beginning of the pandemic, I believe that the European Union has shown in these last 3 years that actually it is or can be very fast, very united, and essential, very relevant. Again, I take these two cases to give examples. Think of the pandemic, think of the situation with COVID. Without the European Union, we wouldn't have had vaccines across the European Union member states. Maybe in Belgium, yes, because Pfizer is there, but probably elsewhere would have been more difficult. We wouldn't have probably effective supply chains of medical supplies. We wouldn't have had Next Generation EU, the recovery fund, with, for the first time ever, and I know this is seen in different ways across the European Union, but with something that objectively has been an historic step, I would say a taboo that has been broken, meaning the European Union borrowing money on the market with the EU budget as a guarantee, something that had never happened before, ever, ever, ever. And that actually, I believe that even the week before it happened, if you asked anybody in Brussels, anyone would have told you this is going to be impossible, never, never, never. And actually it was tried several times and never managed. So things, three things: vaccines, a supply chain of medical supplies, and a recovery fund, that wouldn't have happened if not for the European Union. On the other side, look at the war. The moment when Russia invaded Ukraine, imagine what could have happened had we not have the European Union in place. I've asked myself this several times. What if the Russian invasion in Ukraine was happening in an environment that was very much looking like before the Second World War? Most likely, we would have had a fragmented Europe. Most likely, we would have had different alliances and splits and camps. Maybe not, but most likely, yes. Having the European Union united, I think, has, first of all, obviously together with NATO, first of all, protected literally protected our continent, the rest of our continent. Second, it has allowed us to act very quickly, as actually the European Union acted very quickly also in response to the pandemic, very quickly on supporting Ukraine in ways that no member state could have done alone. And not even NATO, because the sensitivities with NATO are so deep from a military perspective that there are limits to what the alliance can do. I'm a big fan of NATO. I actually started maybe more on the defense and NATO side than on the European Union and foreign policy side. But if NATO gets too involved, you know that very well, probably in this room, that triggers or can trigger an escalation of the conflict, which is something that is normal and natural for a military alliance, but is not applying to the European Union because it is not a military alliance, but whatever it is, the European Union, a political integrated entity. So it has allowed being in the Union to do things that alone we couldn't have done, and to do things that have complemented and sometimes really balanced or integrated what NATO could do with its own means, or bilaterally every member state could do with its own means. First of all, the sanctions. Sometimes we underestimate the fact that we couldn't have sanctions in place if not through the European Union. And actually, one of the things that the UK has lost, I believe, is with Brexit, is the capacity to give inputs to the decision-making of the sanction regime. They can apply them, they can implement them, but they cannot take part to the decision-making of the sanction regime of the European Union. And sanctions applied to one country only are very little effective, as we know very well. So sanctions in the first place. And here again, the European Union has adopted so many packages of sanctions so fast and so deep that I think has had clearly a political and an economic impact. If then this impact translates into a change of policy from the Putin regime, this is to be discussed, because the paradox of sanctions is that they function at best in democratic regimes because the accountability towards the public opinion is stronger. And this is the paradox we're facing. But the signal of isolation and the economic impact on the Russian system is clearly heavy. Sanctions, the military support. Obviously, without the European Union in place, all member states, bilaterally, through mechanisms of coordination, through some mechanisms of coordination with NATO too, would have mobilized, for sure, military support. But the fact that the European Union as such has managed to do that for the very first time made me very proud. We worked a lot during my mandate to start. I'll come to that in a minute, because then I'm still at the part of the critical juncture. Then I'll look back and forward. I'll come back to the defense part of our work before, but the fact that the European Union has managed to mobilize funds to deliver arms and military support to Ukraine is something that is a first ever. We needed a war in Europe to do so. Sadly, probably yes. But I think that once we have accepted the idea that hard power can go together with soft power, I think that now this is a lesson that will stay with us. And yes, indeed, we have mobilized. When I say we, I say still the European Union. I'm out of job, but as you see, I'm not out of mandate. I've always done what I believed, so it's easy to continue saying the same things because they are in my mind and my heart. So we have delivered arms, we have delivered military support, which is something that nobody would have expected from the European Union before. A little bit like the borrowing money with the guarantee of EU budgets for the recovery plan. It was a taboo that was broken somehow, that the European Union was going military, which I think was a very important and welcome step. Then, with the financial support to Ukraine, this is something actually that the European Union has done since many years. And to me, this is really the insurance on Ukraine's survival. The package of financial support of the European Union to Ukraine has been bigger than any other package of financial support that the European Union has ever put in place for anyone. And I think this is the real reason why Ukraine is today so resilient. I would never forget that the first time and almost only that I met Putin, it was 2014, and I got the clear impression that his plan, his idea at that time was to make Ukraine implode from within, from a social and economic point of view. And then turn to the Europeans and say, why should you care about a failed state? Leave it to us. And this didn't happen exactly because the European Union supported the reform agenda in Ukraine, including with a very substantial economic package and financial package that now makes it so that Ukraine can fight back, which I have my doubts would have happened this way 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, where Ukraine was in a different state. Then the political and diplomatic support that the European Union as such has given to Ukraine and to the respect and defense of international law in international fora. The UN is not probably in the best shape today, but still is the place where the world comes together. And it has been the European Union mobilizing support across the world with difficulties, with challenges, a lot of them, but still, it has been the main driver, the main player, together with the United States, around the political and diplomatic support for Ukraine. And last but absolutely not least, the other big taboo that has been broken in this last couple of years, and that is granting Ukraine the candidate status to join the European Union. Again, if you ask me or anybody in this room and beyond, would you believe that in one day in 2022 or 23, the European Union would have granted Ukraine the candidate status? Everybody would have said, no, too big, too poor, which is still true. And we'll have still plenty of challenges ahead if we want to make it real, starting from the EU budget, because having Ukraine in means that every single member state becomes a net contributor. And good luck with the agricultural policy, but this is another story. But giving a serious European perspective, giving a serious European Union membership perspective to Ukraine and Moldova has an enormous significance from a political point of view, has an enormous impact on the pace of reforms in Ukraine, and a boost to the morale of people that are resisting a military aggression, and maybe will then manage to trigger, and this is my personal hope, and I can imagine we can have a lot of questions and discussion about that, but I hope and I believe this will have to trigger also a broader reflection on how many member states will we have in the European Union, because we have in total 10 potential new member states, some of them already negotiating, even at quite an advanced pace. And if we're serious on Ukraine, then we might need to be serious on others too. And this might trigger a very healthy discussion and conversation about what kind of European Union we want for the future. How do we function? How does the institutional setup function? How many commissioners do we have? How do we decide? How do we shape our budget? Do we need own resources? And so on and so forth. A lot of conversations that have been going on in these last years, but have been going on as a background, almost academic discussion, as if it was not relevant for real life of the institutions. I think that today, and probably in the next institutional cycle, as of next European elections, these discussions will need to be serious and will need to be grounded in the reality of what is then done in the European institutions. Somehow the conference on the future of Europe that was done last year, I think will really come in the real terms next year and the year afterwards, when the reflection on what kind of European Union we'll have in the future will become real, with the option of having new member states, because that will clearly change the picture. provided that the United Kingdom doesn't decide also to rejoin, and then it will be even more interesting. But that's another story. So now looking back and focusing a little bit more narrowly on common security and defense policy, because again, I think that this is one of the areas where the European Union has done the most in the last years, and also I think it's going to be one of the frontiers of the future of the European Union, and not an easy one, quite a controversial one internally. Well, I shouldn't say this here, but also in other member states for different reasons. Now, looking back, we had, I mean, I don't want to look too much back, but since 50, 60 years, a discussion about the defense pillar of the community and the union. Nothing was done for many decades. Then we had the Lisbon Treaty. Sorry, I'm synthesizing very much, but just to give the timeline. Then with the Lisbon Treaty, we had the seed that was planted. The Lisbon Treaty gave the Union the possibility to develop as a military player and the security and defense player. Did we use it? Not really. Not really until very recently. There was a lot in the Lisbon Treaty that was in potential, but not really activated. We looked at that when I started my mandates, also thanks to the fact that the President of the Commission at the time, Juncker, was very much behind that, and also member states. And we took the brave decision with the global strategy of 2016 that we presented a couple of days after the Brexit referendum. That was a perfect timing. We decided to try and activate the potential of the Lisbon Treaty on security and defense. And so at that time, we put in place a set of instruments that were foreseen already by the treaty, but were not activated before. I have to admit, on a personal note, this is the single file on which all my team, none excluded, told me, don't do it because you will hit the wall. Member states will not go that way. The parliament's mixed. Why do you want to create problems? We have so much on our plate. Why should you work on defense? It's not going to work. And I have to admit, this is one of the few files on which I didn't listen to my team, because when I was still member of parliament in Italy, I was in the defense committee, and I remembered all the years when I was year by year waiting for the European Council in December every year to deliver something on defense. And then as a member of parliament, I was seeing that nothing was coming up. And I was so frustrated to see that there was a potential and it was not used. And so I thought, okay, I'll try. And so I had an excellent team, especially in the External Action Service, the military committee, but also in the council and the commission, and a lot of political support by the rest of the leadership. That was really trying to push it forward. And member states that were really, really very much on board on making the European Union security and defense pillar a reality. Why did it happen? How did it happen? Well, first of all, what happened? It happened that we put in place instruments. Now, I don't want to go too much in the technicalities. If you want, we can go back to that. But looking backwards, that was it. Basically, we activated the permanent structured cooperation, so-called PESCO, that allows groups of member states to work on common projects in the framework of the European Union on security and defense. Which is something that was never done before. And we started that, especially on capabilities, working in parallel with NATO to identify projects on capability developments that were needed also for the alliance on European soil. So in that way, we're trying to match NATO needs with European Union needs, and incentivized by the European funds, because that was the trick. If member states were to reach the 2% investment in defense, as they committed in the NATO summit in Warsaw, then after the financial crisis of the years 2000, this would have been very difficult. So we thought we use the European Union instruments to incentivize common projects of member states to fill in the gap of capabilities that are required to reach the 2% investment target in NATO. So it was a way to use, in a smart way, the European Union to incentivize member states to reach a NATO goal. So extremely complementary to NATO and a very strong partnership with NATO. And then we activated other instruments, CARD, the military control center, other instruments to basically activate all the potential of the European Union as a defense and security actor. Including the European Peace Facility that today is used to deliver military support to Ukraine, and the European Defence Fund that supports industrial projects in the field of defence, some of them dual use, with the budget. So why did that happen at that moment and not before? It's not the magic of me deciding to go against the wall and winning. No, it's because in that moment, 2016, 2017, 2018, in the European Union, there was a strong demand for security. It was after the terrorist attacks on European soil, and all the opinion polls were indicating that there was one field on which, across all member states, non-excluded, citizens wanted a more integrated European Union work, and that was security and defense. Probably there was not too much of an understanding of what was external or internal security, but it was a demand of a European approach to security. Also, we were surrounded by crises and wars, we still are. So there was a push, there was a political demand, and there was the reflex of many member states to support this. And I wouldn't have ever managed this if the member states, all of them non-excluded, wouldn't have taken the lead, some of them in a very courageous manner. And so we ended up activating the permanent structured cooperation that is, by definition, something that is done with a smaller group of member states. We were 28 at the time. We took all these decisions by unanimity, with still the UK at the table. I say this to come back afterwards on the qualified majority voting that I'm sure will come up in the conversation. Member states took the lead, and we ended up activating the permanent structured cooperation that we imagined might maybe involve 15, 16 member states. We ended up being 25 out of 28, and the remaining 3 were for very obvious reasons related to their national situation. So looking back, I would say that those years, it was, we had to make the argument, we had to discuss why we had to become also a security and defense player, but it was done. And I would say we finished our mandate 2019 with a security and defense structure that was not only on paper, but also in reality starting to function. Then what happened? It happened that the pandemic came at the beginning of the new commission, and I think that this slowed down the work on defense and security, naturally. I have a political background. I've been in politics for long, not anymore, but I understand perfectly well, if you're a minister, if you're a prime minister, if you're a member of parliament, in the middle of the pandemic, go out there and say, we need to invest in security and defense. I'm not sure I would do it in the moment when your priority is to get people in hospitals and out of hospitals in particular. So there was a moment of submarining. And then with a very good move came the strategic compass from the High Representative Borrell, that is an excellent roadmap for implementation of all the steps that we need to take collectively on security and defense. So looking backwards, there have been different steps, the last of which is, I believe, the strategic compass that already entails a lot of work that has been done and will need to be done. And then in the last year, a massive investment in 2 instruments that we have and that we had created in the years 2018-19, the European Peace Facility to deliver military support to our partners, in this case, Ukraine. If I'm not wrong, it has reached 8 billion euros. Nobody would have imagined that when we created it. And the European Defence Fund to support industrial projects of the European Union, which, I don't deny it, can open controversial issues with the industry of defense in the United States, or common projects that some of our member states might have with the United States on the industry of defense. But we also need to fill our gaps in terms of industrial investments, and this is a way of doing that. Looking ahead, because I think I exceeded my time. Looking ahead, what comes next in the field of security and defense? I don't have the crystal ball, and I don't have any role to lead that way anymore. My guess, which would also be my advice if I were asked, would be to, and I'm sorry, it doesn't sound exciting, but sometimes good and wise things don't sound exciting. In my view, what we would need to do on security and defense today as Europeans is more of the same, meaning that finally we've moved and now we need consistency, which is sometimes a very hard thing to do, because when you have big new projects, there's a wave of enthusiasm, or when there is an external urgency or needs, then there's the push also politically, but then to maintain the level of investment, to maintain the level of political will is the most challenging thing. So I would say that what we need to do is to continue to keep the path, meaning keeping the path of strengthening and deepening cooperation and partnership with NATO, which is something that has grown in parallel with the strengthening of the EU defense and security capability, to keep investing in our output. Here I would say something that comes more from my parliamentary and NATO background. We focus a lot on the 2% investment, 2% of the budget investment on defense. What would worry me the most is not how much we spend, is the output of what we spend, because you can spend 2% on salaries for generals, good, but what we need is a good output of what we invest on. And continuing to invest in doing things together so that we create the economy of scale that makes it sustainable, both financially and from a research, technology, and industry point of view. Again, it doesn't sound sexy at all, but I think this is what we need. Then there is a lot of talks about, and has always been, a European army or other things. Personally, and here again, I might be anticipating questions, and personally, I never really grasped what it means, a European army. Maybe it's my limit, but an army has a chain of command that terminates in the political level. That is a minister of defense and ultimately head of state and government, depending on the constitutional system. Do we think really that in the European Union we would have one army that would replace or get in parallel with national armies, with one chain of command, with one person that would decide where to mobilize? I don't see this. I don't see this. And I don't even see particularly the merit of having that. What I see is the need to make much more effective the instruments we have, including the capacity to mobilize troops fast enough and in a way that doesn't get stopped in the generation of forces. Again, I don't want to go too technical, but this is what we need. But is this an army? Not necessarily. These are instruments that we already have. For instance, we have the battle groups since ever, and we never used it. So there are instruments to be operational on the ground, on theater, without necessarily talking about things that might be very scary for political levels or public opinions across Europe, and might not really be necessary. My approach to security and defense pillar of the European Union has always been this, and I modestly think it was very wise. On this, I listened to my team, to go gradual and pragmatic, which I guess can be a Danish way of going, meaning that without setting the bar too high and say, okay, we need to create a completely different system. The approach we adopted, and that was successful because it was reassuring and pragmatic, was to say, okay, let's start by doing what we can do tomorrow. Let's start by activating what we have already in the treaties. Let's try to start putting the money where our mouth is. And let's see where this builds up. And I think that this is exactly the way in which we could make the European security and defense pillar grow, and make Denmark not regretting the choice of joining. So to conclude, I think that indeed, looking backwards and looking ahead, I think that indeed, when I started in 2014, I had to make the point of why the European Union was relevant at all. That was my main point. I mean, when I started, the question was, even including in the people working with me in Italy, I was a minister of a G7 country, and my team was saying, why should you leave this to go to the High Representative, Vice President? Is the European Union as relevant as we can be as a member state, as a country? That time, the point was why is the European Union, or should the European Union be relevant at all in the world of today? And we had to make the case. I think that, and then we had a moment when 2016, 17, people were even saying the European Union is going to dissolve after Brexit. I think that today, nobody thinks of dissolving the European Union anymore. And I think that today everybody understands why the European Union is relevant. I think, maybe I'm too optimistic, but this is my sense, that today we still need to make the case, but it's much more self-evident in what the European Union serves us, for what it is functional to our needs. Again, being vaccines or being the reaction to the aggression from the Russian Federation to Ukraine. So I would say we are in a bad place globally, but I think we are in a good place from a European Union perspective. And I am quite confident that our union will grow in numbers and in strength and in confidence, because sometimes we forget how good we are, and there is no way of doing good if you don't remind yourself of the instruments you have. And I think this is the lesson we have learned in these years. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to exchanging with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I put these on. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. And I know there's a million questions out there, but I would just want to say, maybe ask the first question here, because actually in 2015, Zygmunt Bauman, the Polish Jewish philosopher, said the EU is like an airplane on autopilot in which the runway is being built. And that is how the people in the EU felt. And so to my knowledge is that, like, what I see, the decision to create the strategic thinking that you put into it, is the first time I really saw a very strong strategic framework for the EU. And is that something that you said you built it up gradually, but still the framework was extremely, capable of addressing a lot of, you could say, the external dangers that we were seeing on the one hand, but with, or also internal dissolving, but with external means.
Oh, thank you, first of all.
Yeah.
Sometimes the European Union is an automatic pilot.
Yeah.
But I think every big administration, every big machine, even in the private sector, every big corporate, multinational corporates has an element of automatic pilot, because no big system could function otherwise. And also because the administration is big and it's very capable. And I don't think I say any mystery here by saying that the administration, which I always refuse to call bureaucracy because this has a negative impact. I never found civil servants and diplomats as good as I found in the European Union. But the administration in Brussels has often the impression that they are the automatic pilots and commissioners and presidents come and go, which is true. But it's also the strength of a public administration that functions, having this element. The automatic pilot can save you sometimes. So it's good. So yes, I found sometimes that the feeling that things were in the pipeline, and so things that were in the pipeline would have come out regardless of whatever. But I also found out that the European Union has an amazing capacity to deactivate the automatic pilot and go its own way, given two conditions. The first one is that the member states and the European institutions, but mainly the member states, feel the same sense of urgency on one topic. Unless that happens, and until that happens, it's the automatic pilot that goes. You need a trigger, you need a moment when in the European Council or in the Foreign Affairs Council or in the Energy Council, in the Council, still it's in the Council, and here I'm using the two heads, you have a moment where member states look at each other and say, okay, here we need to do something. And that is a very dangerous moment because the automatic pilot is safe. The we need to do something moment can be dangerous because you might also end up doing something that is not necessarily a good idea to do. But in those moments, if you have a common understanding from the member states that there is an urgency that needs to be addressed, that is the moment of creativity. That is the moment where the European Union is able of doing extraordinary things. This was the moment when, yes, we did the defense work. Absolutely, yes. And it was after Brexit, and it was during the Trump electoral campaign. So that was a moment where, yes, there was a big push from the public opinions to have security at European level, but it was also an element of reaction that I think in all member states, public opinions and the political level was saying, we need to take, well, Chancellor Merkel said it clearly, we need to take our destiny in our hands. That was a bit the refrain. But also in the reaction to COVID, it took a few weeks because in some member states, it was evident from day one that this was serious. In other member states, a bit less. But in the moment when all member states reach the same level of understanding of the urgency, then it triggers a reaction. It happened, well, on the war, it happened immediately. So I think that the European Union is capable of doing great things when it's capable of navigating safely with an automatic pilot, which is very good. But also it's able to deactivate the automatic pilot and explore unthinkable routes, creative routes in moments of crisis. The famous quote, the European Union was beforged in its reactions, through its reactions to the crisis. It's unfortunately, but also luckily true. The point is, if we manage to do this also without a major crisis, but I think it's what I've seen is an extraordinary capacity to react. The strategy was actually, I have to say, in 2016, a suggestion of Solana. Okay. The very first thing I did when I was appointed High Representative, I traveled to Madrid and I met him. He is a great inspiration for me, both as Secretary General of NATO and the first High Representative of the European Union, not yet Vice President. And I asked him for advice. What do you think it would be good for me to do? And he said, first thing, Federica, first thing, we have a security strategy that I did that starts by saying the world has never been safer and more cooperative and look around, and it's so put it in the bin and do another one. So I follow this advice, but it was a collective effort, and really there the point was to try and shape the sense of direction beyond the urgency of the day, because in those years we had, contrary to today we have 2 or 3 big challenges that are existential challenges: Ukraine, climate, and a few others. There we had the impression, and we had the reality of a multiple layers of crisis that were altogether existential, but each of them alone were just a day-by-day reaction to things. It was Syria, it was Libya, it was the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, Afghanistan, Venezuela, you name it. And we needed to find a sense of direction that was giving us a compass beyond the daily management of the crisis separately. What is it that guides us in the reactions to crisis or in our international relations beyond crisis? And it was also a lot of effort on focusing on the positive. yes, we have crises to handle, but we also have a lot of friends and partners we sometimes neglect because we are too focused on crisis. What do we do with our friends and partners with a positive agenda? It can be trade, it can be human rights, it can be democracy and development, it can be climate, it can be energy. So we were trying also to, and then there was a big internal part that for me was really one of the most important ones, together with defense. And that was the internal work to bring together the different institutions. And that was really, I think, a very big achievement in those years that has stayed today to a certain extent. Ups and downs.
Thank you. So I'll open up the floor for questions. Who will be first? I have one here. And if you present yourself, there's a microphone coming here because we have live stream here today. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Federica Mogherini. I would like to ask you, following up on your description of the defense and security policy, where you mentioned that the goal is not to build an army, but that also means that the definition of the range of what belongs to a defense and security policy might be broader. And what I will ask you about, how do you look on the crisis of migrants, immigration, as is it part of your understanding of the defense and security policy? And behind that also, of course, the situation in Africa, from where many of the migrants will come. Where will you put the limits on what belongs to a defense and security policy?
Thank you for the question. This is one of the topics and themes on which we have worked the most during those years, being the refugee crisis, mainly reaching its peak in 2015. So that was a lot on our agenda. I have to admit that being Italian and coming from Italy, this was not a surprise or not new for me. In a few countries, especially in the south of Europe, the migratory flows were already clearly a reality since many years. In Spain, in Italy, in Malta, Greece, it was a reality since many years. I will answer very clearly to your question. I don't put neither the migratory, neither the refugee policies in any way in the security and defense basket at all. I think there is no way of dealing with the migratory and refugee flows, which are two different phenomena and have two different legal international frameworks and have to be dealt separately, even if sometimes the flows are mixed. And this is one of the challenges, but I don't believe that there is any way of dealing with those flows from a security and defense point of view. I think the only way to handle that is first to open legal channels of migration for the migratory flows, because today is almost impossible to reach European Union legally if you are a migrant. I'm not talking about refugees now. And yet in Europe, we desperately need migrants because of our demographic situation. I think we say this too little and too shy in Europe. It's politically very difficult to say this, I know very well, but it's the reality of facts. Without migrants in the European Union, entire sectors of our economies would simply collapse, not to mention our pension system. So we need migrants. The point is, how do the migrants get legally and transparently to the European Union countries? This is the point. We don't have functioning legal channels of migration in place. This is problem number one. And I have the impression that this is not tackled effectively because this is politically very costly for anyone to say loud, which I find is a lack of leadership, to say the least. Second, we need, and on this, the work has started in 2015. We need to be, and is slowly and with ups and downs going on. We need a multilateral work, a collective work with the countries of origin, with the countries of transit, and with the United Nations system, IOM and UNHCR. Because to manage the flow, if you think of managing the flow only at our borders or just outside of our borders, it's too late. Especially if the borders are at sea, you cannot, I mean, for international law, you cannot, just you cannot build a wall in the middle of the sea, and you cannot let people drown. You have a duty to rescue at sea. That's as long as we believe in international law and rule of law, we have to apply it. So the point is to handle the flows before they start in the countries they cross and before they get to Europe. And this is possible, absolutely possible, with an humble and constant work with all the countries in the way and with the international community, mainly UNHCR and IOM involved in this work. This started a bit during those years with trilateral partnerships within the European Union, the African Union, and the United Nations. To my knowledge, it's still going on, but it's obviously very difficult and takes a lot of time. But I think this is the only sustainable way towards that. And then on the refugee flows, which is something different. Normally, well, actually, they come from many different parts of the world, because unfortunately, there are many different parts of the world where conflicts or even climate produces flows of refugees that have right to be protected and have right to asylum. In this case, indeed, well, here we have very different policies, member state to member state, but here we have an international protection system normally arranged and organized by the UNHCR. And here we should be able, as member states, as European Union, to guarantee international protections to all those that, not all of them in Europe, but we should take our parts in terms of protecting refugees that are entitled to international protection. And also this can be done in an orderly manner, even if, yes, it's also this complicated. Also because most of the times, the political discourse, the public discourse mixes refugees and migrants in one box. And it's two legal status that are different. And sometimes it's also personal stories that are very different. Well, I spent a lot of time in countries of origin, in countries of transit. My very first visit to sub-Saharan Africa has been in Niger, in Agadez, which is the main crossroad before they enter into Libya, to go and understand what happened on the ground. And it was very easy to understand. I landed there in an airport that was not an airport anymore, but used to be an airport. And the community leader that welcomed me, together with all the community leaders of the place, explained me that few years before, in that non-existing anymore airports, there were plenty of charter flights that were landing with tourists to visit the desert. And then with the security situation in the Sahel, terrorist groups and trafficking organizations, tourism had stopped. And so the economy had reconverted in whatever was available, which means trafficking people. And so their message was very clear: bring us back security, bring us back tourists, and the flow will stop because we will have other things to do, which is very cynical, but you understand it. It's a logic that you can grasp. And so this is why I'm saying there are ways of handling this. The point is that there is no magic wand. There is no measure that makes it stop or makes it manage it from one day to another. You need months or years of investment and consistency, while most of the times our domestic political cycles are very short. So we have leaderships that need to deliver in 6 months, 1 year, 2 years maximum, and it's already a long time, while sometimes solutions require much longer times, real solutions. And then sometimes we end up putting together solutions that are temporary, not necessarily effective solutions that maybe can be effective as a discourse, but not really on the ground.
Thank you for this comprehensive answer.
I have to answer a bit short. I'm sorry.
No, because I think it's very interesting to hear this understanding, because this is something that we're all thinking of, but what is really done. And I think I have a follow-up question, and I hope it won't take too much, but because one of the things that I think is it a possibility that the EU representatives, the EU embassies, you might say, is actually the point of entry for legal migration?
You can ask those in the room that have been head of delegations or EU ambassadors. I'll give you the answer that I would give if I were in a press room.
Yeah.
The consular activities are competence of member states. So all consular activities are for the member states to have. There have been exceptions in the last years. Also here, the trigger of urgency has created creative solutions. So in the last couple of years, for instance, the EU embassies or the EU delegations in the world have helped bringing back EU nationals during the pandemic. If we had, if there was maybe a Dane in a country far away where there is no Danish embassy, so no representation, or where the European Union was organizing charters to bring back Europeans from different places in a coordinated manner. But in general terms, all consular activities, including permits and visas, it's all member states. Am I right? I ask for confirmation. Because I mean, I'm talking to an audience that has some experience and knowledge about the practices.
Okay, we have a question over here. Yes.
My name is Eric Jurgensen, and my question is on cyber attacks and the development which is in that very threatening sphere. So I'd like you to share your reflections on how well dressed or how well prepared you think the EU is to counterbalance or to deal with those with this threat. I'm thinking, I mean, we have the elections in the US very soon, and England, et cetera, and it really threatens alliances and nations.
On this, I will be much shorter because I'm not an expert on the field, and I tend to admit when I do not have a smart answer to give, and be transparent on that. Cybersecurity is one of the fields that I know the least. So I cannot judge how well prepared we are on this. I think there are two different things here in your question. One is cybersecurity proper, and the other one is the interference of foreign forces in communication and disinformation in the campaigns, for instance. And I think that in both cases, we have a lot of work to do yet. Not only in Europe, I think that everywhere in the world we are struggling with that. On cybersecurity proper, to my knowledge, there are some member states that are very well equipped and very advanced. Well, Estonia is the typical example because they've suffered cyber attacks in the past in a very serious manner, and so they have developed a system. I think that to a certain extent, that knowledge has been shared with member states and with the European Union. To what extent this is now embedded systematically in the European Union systems, I don't know, and my impression is that we still need to work a lot on that, as everybody else. And this is, by the way, cybersecurity, one of the fields where the European Union and NATO cooperate the most, because obviously it's a common space, and there's a common interest in developing practices and protocols together, including exercises. On misinformation and disinformation and interferences, external interferences in campaigns, I think that here, we have advanced a lot. Well, there's going to be things coming up from the Commission in the coming weeks, I think, if not already done, also in view of the European elections next year. I think it's a thin line for us Europeans in particular, because it can always be argued, if you don't frame it legally correctly, that you touch freedom of speech and opinion. And this for us Europeans is obviously more sensitive than for others in the world, because we care a lot about our civil rights and our freedoms. But I think, from what I understood, that the new directives and the new initiatives that are coming up find the right path to protect our democratic system without entering into complex and contested charters of public freedoms and individual freedoms. But I think it's a sensitive issue on which we should find a way. But personally, I wouldn't have the answer to that.
Thank you. And another question here.
Thank you so much for your analysis, which is much appreciated. My name is Angelique. I'm a College of Europe alumni. celebrating 20 years this year. I've also worked for the past 15 years in the EAS and NATO. So I was really happy to hear you say what you said about what some of the priorities would be, and that would be strengthening or further strengthening the NATO-EU cooperation. So in that regard, I would love to hear your thoughts about what can be done more concretely, because I understand it's a very difficult thing to further strengthen this cooperation. And what would be the top challenges in your opinion? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, EU-NATO partnership is one of the things that have always passionated me a lot. First of all, it's great to see an alumna that has always been also been working in the ES, so we covered the same ground. I think that, well, the most common obstacle that normally is pointed at as a challenge for EU-NATO stronger partnership is normally the difference in membership, Cyprus, Turkey. This is usually the element that is mentioned as the main obstacle for deepening and strengthening cooperation. Personally, I think that, and as you know very well, but this is just for the benefit of the audience, there are some things that the European Union and NATO cannot share, like intelligence, for instance, exactly for this reason, or the formality of meetings. It's impossible basically to have, not at political level obviously, but at ambassadors levels. It's joint meetings are the formality of exchanges is complicated. But I have to admit, and again, I'm speaking here for my personal experience, but from what I see, this is continuing. This doesn't really impede or stop in any way very deep, a daily, very strong cooperation and partnership that I think is really the strength of our security and defense. I'm always very much impressed and shocked, not positively, when I see how sometimes we still struggle as Europeans, I guess not so much in Denmark, but sometimes across Europe, we struggle still to combine our European and our transatlantic identity as if they were two different things. To me, they're exactly the same thing. And they are the two sides of the same coin. And it should be natural to have these two elements of identity together in our DNA. What we have lived in the last couple of years in our reaction to Ukraine has shown this. We have activated a very strong reaction, I believe, activating some instruments from the NATO side, some other instruments from the EU side, and all in cooperation and in coordination in a complementary way. And I always had the impression that, yes, there are some things that NATO can do that the European Union cannot do, also because the European Union, yes, has developed a lot the security and defense pillar, but it's not a military alliance. Our raison d'etre, our mission is a different one. We can develop the hard power, but still we're not a military alliance. We're doing something else. So there are things that NATO can do that the European Union doesn't aspire at doing, but also there are sometimes things that NATO could do technically, but politically would be very risky for NATO to do, because because it's a military alliance, to do certain steps might trigger a military reaction and an escalation in the conflict, for instance. And there comes the fact that the European Union can come in with a softer perception, let's put it this way, of steps that are taken, because not being a military alliance is less polarizing, let's put it this way. So I've seen in practice a very strong cooperation, a very strong coordination in these last few years, very much so. Personally, I have experienced during my 5 years an excellent level of coordination at all levels, from me with Stoltenberg. I mean, I have to tell you this little anecdote. The very first person I met when I entered in office has been Stoltenberg, just to give the signal that I wanted to work on defense and I wanted to strengthen EU-NATO cooperation. It was a controversial choice, but that was the first ever meeting that I had on the 1st of November 2014 in Brussels, and he's still there. I think he will stay there forever. if it goes well on the top, then it triggers down, and there is no element of formal impediment that can stop practical cooperation if it's needed. What more can be done? For sure, a lot on cyber, for sure, a lot on division of labor. I think there will be the need to develop much more. Obviously, now the situation in Ukraine doesn't make it very evident, but I think that the NATO work on the link between climate change and defense will need to be developed much more. The footprint of military activities and also the military approach that can be taken in areas of climate disasters or of climate change sensitive areas can be developed, which is something that was on NATO agenda before the war in Ukraine started, and on which I think the European Union can help NATO develop this, and they could work together. All of this, obviously, pending the US elections next year. But if everything goes in the same direction as today, I think that there are avenues of cooperation. And obviously, then there is the entire element of the future of Ukraine and the Eastern Partnership countries. What about them in terms of security guarantees once the war will be over, which is a big chapter for EU-NATO cooperation and reconstruction.
I would love to come with a follow-up question to that, but I have a question down there that I think I should take first. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Peter Bruckner. Looking at the history of Brexit, I don't think that the common defense and security policy was a controversial issue. Would it be possible, in your view, legally and politically, to establish a closer cooperation between the UK and the EU in matters concerning defense and security? For instance, could they cooperate within PESCO, the European Defense Agency, etc., etc.?
Absolutely, yes, they can. They can, to my knowledge. Again, here I speak under the control of colleagues, friends that might know better than me, but they definitely can. PESCO foresees cooperation with countries, so that is possible. And also the UK still can, I think, on this, I'm not 100% sure, but normally it is the case, as it is the case for non-European Union countries that are partners for the European Union, contribute to the EU missions and operations and all the work that is done in the European Union on defense and security. The difference is that it could contribute as a partner and not as a member, meaning that it could somehow join things that have been decided by the EU member states, but it would not be able to decide anymore. So it has lost the power to decide, but I think in most fields still has the right to, or the possibility, not the right, because then the decision is for the member states of the European Union, obviously, but has the possibility to join projects or single initiatives of the European Union. For instance, can ally on sanctions. The European Union decides on the sanctions, and that the UK can align its own policies to the sanctions that the European Union has decided, for instance. So in a more passive way, I believe that in most sectors, it can still do it. Yeah, I would say so. Then I think that in practical terms, for the UK, it is still very relevant to maintain a level of cooperation and coordination with the European Union on European security. And this means in practical terms, in the framework of NATO, as we just discussed, but also in the framework of the Security Council, where the UK has a permanent seat, and where till the very last day before leaving the Union, that was after I left, the UK has been coordinating and sometimes even speaking on behalf of the European Union. It was very surreal. Still in 2018, 2019, sometimes you had press conferences of all the EU member states, representatives to the United Nations that were sitting in the Security Council, where the spokesperson was the UK permanent rep on behalf of the European Union member states, which was effective at the end of the day, because sometimes they were the pen holder on some files. But it's because with whom otherwise would they coordinate in that framework? Naturally, obviously, with the United States, as we also do. But there is a European component of security work that, especially in the multilateral setups, again, the United Nations, but it can be also others, I think there is a natural convergence of interests when it comes to the UK and the European Union.
Yes.
And this is my view. You should ask the UK.
Yeah. Yes, and the floor.
Hi, I'm Nataman Abde. I'm ambassador of Georgia to Denmark. And in the interest of time, I will not ask questions about Georgia, let's say, because there are many dimensions of that. It could take long time.
I would like to ask you questions about Georgia.
Please do, please do. But I have also served as a World Health Organization head in New York, especially during pandemic time, but also before. And I remember you coming very often to New York at the time. And I want to return to your remarks about pandemic and lessons that the whole world has learned about it. And it's not really within the European Union or any other alliance, but it's also about the global lessons that we learned. And although pandemic is over, and perhaps European Union has managed it well for its members and populations, but we still have consequences of the global inequities in handling the pandemic, and there have been many more deaths outside of non-vaccinated populations and so on. So I think the whole world is at a critical junction, not just European Union. And I think you have covered very interestingly interface of NATO and changing role of EU and stronger positioning of the defense policy. But I would like to return to interface in a bigger picture and wonder what you think about the whole role of the UN, especially in these critical times when we have Security Council member leading the war. How do you see the future way of intervention role of the UN altogether in terms of handling such situations, and how will EU within its new role and perhaps enlarged EU deal with all this within this NATO, EU, global UN, and bigger players, other players than that?
Wow, how many hours do we have? Challenging question. First of all, yes, I think that the European Union took a while before starting to handle the pandemic well. In those weeks, in particular, my own country lost many lives. So when I say the European Union handled well the pandemic, relatively, meaning that even in those weeks, even one day was costing many lives. What I would say is that the European Union finally got in the right place, and it didn't take months, it took weeks, which is already good, but it could have taken days instead of weeks, but at least it got to the right place, let's put it this way. And I'm aware that, yes, it handled things well, vaccines, medical supplies, solidarity, because we've seen also cross-border solidarity within the European Union medical assistance, and the recovery plan. I wouldn't be 100% sure that the pandemic is over. Probably this wave of the pandemic is over, but I think that we will live with pandemics in the coming years and decades. I'm not an expert. I don't understand anything about medicine, but it's quite clear to me that we have to get ready for this to come back in the same or other forms. And I think population is very much aware of that. We don't test almost anymore. But today on my flight, at least 5 or 6 people were wearing masks, and it was Brussels to Copenhagen. So I think that it stays in our minds that, and this has nothing to do with the UN, but it's something I really believe it's important for us collectively to consider. I think this will have a very strong impact, and I see this every day in the college, on the younger generations. We have a generation that has grown up in Europe, with two waves of traumas. First, the terrorist attacks on European soil that was basically telling, especially the younger people, wherever you go in a crowded place, you might be a target. So the crowd is a danger. And then the pandemic telling you the individual is a danger, because if you hug someone, if you kiss someone, you can die. And I'm very worried for the mental health of a generation that has grown up identifying the other in big groups or in individual forms as an existential threat. I don't know what kind of social fabric we might have in 10, 20, 30 years from now. But this is nothing to do with the UN. But still, when we say the pandemic is over, I think that we still need to keep in the back of our mind that it's somehow here to stay, I think. It's a little bit like climate change. We see the effects of it from time to time, for good or for bad, but we sometimes don't focus on the fact that it's ongoing and we have to face it, whether we see the consequences or not. On the UN, I'll be totally frank. I think that I think that this will be the defining work for the next decade. How do we build or rebuild the credibility of international multilateral system? We're not there yet because we're still in the middle of the war and we're still in the wave of the reaction to the pandemic. So we're still digesting it. But I think that this combination of factors has weakened enormously the capacity of the UN system to act credibly and effectively. And this is very difficult for the Europeans and the European Union to say, because saying it loud might contribute to weakening it even further. But on the other side, I think that one day we will need to understand how we rebuild or we build or we change or we reform or we reinvent, I don't know, a functioning multilateral framework, starting from the UN or other, I don't know. But I think I cannot imagine how at the end of the war in Ukraine, things can just start again as before in the Security Council or in the UN agencies. I just don't see it. I just don't see it. I might be limited myself, but I just don't see it. As I don't see, you take another thing that is actually rooted in the UN system, the Iran nuclear deal, that is actually a UN Security Council resolution, because it was mandated by the UN Security Council and it was then ratified by the UN Security Council with a resolution. So technically, the agreement is an annex of a UN Security Council resolution. Even if you had today the best possible agreement in the drawer, I don't see who would sit on stage and take a photo with the Chinese, the Russian, the US, the UK, the German, the French, the EU, and the Iranian foreign minister. It's like, you know, telling a dream. One morning I wake up and I tell my daughter, you know what I dreamt of tonight? That Lavrov and Blinken were on the same stage with the Iranian foreign minister and Borrell shaking hands. So the world of tomorrow, the world after the war, will have to, in one way or another, rethink of how we govern the world somehow. And who will do it, how we will do it, I have no clue. But my guess is that the next 10 years challenge for the European Union will be to sort out the enlargement. And the next 10 years challenge for the global system will be how to redefine the global governance and the multilateral framework. Two easy tasks. So I'm happy that I'm at the College of Europe.
Yeah, thank you so much. I normally say that we have to dream about, we have to make, you know, what as people, we're people who can imagine, and we have to start imagining. The war actually said that we have to start imagining the future for the EU and the future for the UN system. But how do you see, maybe it's too difficult, but one of the things is that Putin was, he was challenging the world order. He was dissatisfied with the world order. And you have states today, like China and India, that might also be dissatisfied with the current world order. How do you balance these dissatisfaction somehow and not create another like a war in the future?
You know, I'm not a Russia expert or a China expert. I'm wondering if I'm an expert at all on anything, but I'm not sure that Russia was dissatisfied with the world order.
No,
I'm not sure. I think that actually for Putin, which is not exactly the same as Russia, but I think that for Putin, the point was to regain the status of the second superpower. And somehow with the war, it has made his point that he is the guy to defeat. He is the bad one. Huh? In the Cold War, it was clear. I think he has a strong nostalgia for that times. I'm not sure he was completely dissatisfied with the world order of before, of now. I mean, of before the war, because somehow Russia had a permanent seat, some relevance, some direct channels, and even bilateral agreements with the United States, for instance, on nuclear and non-nuclear arms control treaties. So its status and was actually playing a disruptive role, but still a role in many areas of the world, in Libya, in Syria, in Africa, in Latin America to a certain extent. And it had maintained, which was a problem for us, is still a problem for us, a very disruptive role in some European countries like Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine. So I'm not 100% sure that Putin was not satisfied with the status he had in the world system before. I think that for China and India, it's slightly different, I think, because my impression is that for Putin, the main point is power and status. While I think that for China and India, it's a much more pragmatic approach, is economy, is investments and trade. I don't think it's power as such. I think it's a much more interest-driven agenda. I don't think that Putin is following an interest-driven agenda, if not the personal ego, maybe. A very distorted way of interpreting it again, but I don't see a rational country interest-led agenda for what he's doing. He has destroyed already Russian economy, Russian status in the world. So I think that China in particular, but also India, have a much more pragmatic and rational agenda. Again, you can argue if Putin's agenda is rational or not, depending on the objective. If you assume his objective is, again, power and status, then he might be behaving rationally to achieve that objective. But I think the Chinese and the Indians are on a different category and on a different page. And I would not compare the two or the three. And I think that one of the mistakes we've done, or let's say one of the things we could have done better, and I think and I hope we'll do better now, is to avoid putting all the rest in one box, as if it was the West on one side and the global South on the other. I think these categories are by far misleading. I think it's not, even using the concept of the West in this case, in the case of the war in Ukraine, is a big mistake, because it's not linked to Western values or European values. It's linked to international values and the UN Charter. And so it should be not the West against the rest. It should be those who violate the UN Charter and those who uphold the international values of living together by the rules that we have shaped together. Then the Chinese would say, yes, but who has written the rules? And here opens the how do you say it in English? Le chantier, the workplace of how do we shape the future rules.
Mrs. Mogherini, Rector Mogherini, thank you so much. We have still questions out there. We have, oh no, if we, if we should end
On
it
your
now.
hands.
Yeah. But thank you so much. I have it's
Thank you.
a small gift, but it's in Danish. It's actually about
I find
international organizations.
friends to translate me. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this
Yeah,
exchange.
yeah. Thank you
And
so much
for the
for coming.
invitation. Thank you.
Yeah,
It's been
as
a
you
pleasure.
can understand, I'm a huge fan, and yeah,
Thank you.
been following your work.
Thank
So good luck in your work, and yeah, let's just give you a big hand.
Thank you.